One fisherman spent 438 days in the open ocean. No engine, no navigation, no contact with land. His boat was pushed off course during a storm, and from that moment, he drifted for thousands of kilometers, fighting the elements, trying not to lose his mind, and holding on to the smallest hope of rescue. His name was José Salvador Alvarenga, and his story became one of the longest and most challenging survival cases ever recorded at sea. Before we continue, I'd appreciate your subscription. Now let's return to the story. On the morning of November 23rd, 2012, José Salvador Alvarenga arrived at the small fishing boat he had worked on for many years. For him, it was an ordinary day. Nothing unusual, nothing unexpected. Just another short trip out to sea that was supposed to last no more than a single day. His task was to catch shark and mahi-mahi, as his employer regularly requested. This wasn't a risky trip or a long-distance route. Local fishermen work the same way every day. Go out in the morning, spend a few hours on the water, and return to shore before nightfall. Their boat was simple, about 7 meters long, lightweight, with an outboard motor, a plastic fish container, a small amount of ice, and a radio, the kind of vessel used constantly in this region. These boats were suitable for near-shore fishing, but were never designed for long journeys or unpredictable weather. Alongside José that day was his younger helper, Ezequiel Cordoba. He wasn't an experienced sailor, but he agreed to assist to earn some money. For him as well, this was supposed to be just another workday. The weather that morning seemed calm. No warnings, no signs of a storm. No one on shore considered this trip dangerous. They loaded their gear, prepared bait containers, checked the engine. And when everything was ready, the boat pushed off from the sandy beach and moved into the bright morning sea. José had no idea that this short trip would become the beginning of a story far longer than a single day. The first hours at sea passed without problems. Alvarenga and Cordoba worked in sync, setting long fishing lines, checking the gear, and moving along their usual route. The weather remained stable, although José noticed the sky darkening slowly on the horizon. It wasn't unusual. Clouds often appeared and disappeared without bringing anything serious. But this time the clouds didn't move on. Instead, they thickened. The wind grew stronger, and the waves began to rise higher than they normally did at that hour. When they tried to make radio contact again, the reply was distorted. The signal drowned in static. José tried a second time, then a third, but the radio barely reacted. About an hour later, the wind turned into violent gusts. Waves slammed against the sides of the boat so hard that Cordoba struggled to stay on his feet. José decided it was time to head back, but at that exact moment, the engine choked. Water was splashing over the stern. The boat was bouncing between the waves, and the motor simply gave out. They tried restarting it several times, but every attempt ended the same way. A short jerk followed by silence. At that point it became clear. Without a working engine, they were entirely at the mercy of the wind and current. The storm intensified. Fishing crates were ripped from their hands, some of their equipment washed overboard. Cordoba shouted that they needed to lighten the boat, but José understood there was almost nothing they could throw away. All they could do was cover what mattered and hang on, hoping the storm would pass quickly. But the storm was only beginning. What first seemed like a temporary inconvenience turned, within hours, into a force that literally tore them away from the shoreline. They no longer controlled the boat. The boat was controlled by the ocean. When the storm finally began to fade, a heavy silence settled around them. Not peaceful, but empty and exhausting. It was the kind of silence that came after the sea and the people in the boat had both been pushed to their limits. José and Ezekiel said nothing at first. They just sat, trying to understand what was left of their boat, their supplies, and their original route. Everything looked worse than they expected. The ice in the container had melted and mixed with seawater. Some of their gear had been washed overboard, and the radio produced nothing but static. The main question was simple. Where were they? But there was no answer. The storm had thrown them so far off course that there was nothing familiar to navigate by. All around them stretched an endless, level ocean, with no sign of land or other vessels anywhere on the horizon. José inspected the boat. The hull was still intact, though flooded and creaking. One panel had cracked, but it wasn't letting in enough water to sink them. The biggest problem was the engine. Several attempts to restart it after the storm had failed. The motor had completely drowned. On the first day, they still believed someone would search for them. Fishermen often ran into trouble, and rescue services were used to responding. They expected that a search would begin soon. But by the second day, that confidence began to fade. The sun dried the water on the floor of the boat, but their strength was draining much faster. There was no fresh water, almost no food, and nothing in sight except endless waves. José understood that if they wanted to survive, they had to start acting immediately. The storm had taken everything except the boat itself, and now they were left alone against the ocean. The first days of drifting made one thing painfully clear. No one knew where they were, and that meant no one was coming anytime soon. After a few days of drifting, it became clear that the problem was no longer just the distance from shore. The real danger was that there was almost nothing left in the boat. There was no fresh water at all. The food they had brought had been soaked during the storm and was now useless. The only things they still had were their hands, a few surviving pieces of gear, and whatever nature was willing to give them. Thirst became the first immediate threat. Seawater was deadly, and José knew it. He reminded Córdoba constantly, especially when the exhausted younger man begged for even a single sip. José had to explain over and over. Drinking seawater would only kill them faster. So they waited for rain. When the first brief shower passed over the ocean, José spread out plastic crates, pieces of tarp, and even his clothing to collect whatever fresh water they could. The rain didn't last long, but they managed to fill one small container. It was barely enough for a few hours of relief. Food was another critical issue. They had no bait and no functioning fishing rods, but they had their hands. José started catching fish the way he had learned as a teenager, by plunging his arm into the water and grabbing small fish as they swam near the surface. It was dangerous and exhausting, but it was their only option. They ate the fish raw right after catching it. At first, Córdoba refused. He felt nauseous and said he couldn't force himself to eat raw flesh, but José insisted that this was their only chance to avoid starvation. Sometimes seabirds would fly close to the boat. José learned to catch them by hand, waiting for a bird to land and then grabbing it quickly. This gave them valuable protein and moisture. There was no stability in their diet, only random opportunities that had to be seized immediately. These first methods of survival didn't guarantee results, but they provided the most important thing: time. And two men on a small drifting boat began to fight for each additional day. The first days of drifting were difficult for both of them, but it quickly became clear that Ezekiel Córdoba was suffering the most. He was younger, less experienced, and far less prepared for the conditions they found themselves in. Constant heat, lack of shelter, salt water soaking their skin, the absence of proper food. and almost no fresh water. All of it wore him down day by day. Around 2 weeks after the storm, Cordoba began to weaken noticeably. He still tried to help catch fish, but he moved slower, sat down more often, and struggled to keep his balance. José saw it, but they were both living at the edge of their strength. Rest wasn't an option. Survival required constant effort. At night, when the temperature dropped slightly, Cordoba shivered from the cold despite the warm air. It was a sign of dehydration and exhaustion. By the 4th week, he began refusing to eat raw fish. The smell alone made him sick. He turned away, covered his mouth, and said he couldn't force himself to eat it anymore. José tried to persuade him. He knew that without food, Cordoba wouldn't last long. But Ezekiel kept shaking his head, repeating that he had no strength left. Soon after, his thoughts started to become disorganized. He asked José what day it was, then asked again minutes later. He said he heard voices on a shore that didn't exist. One day he insisted he saw a ship, waving his arms at empty water. When José told him there was nothing there, Cordoba accused him of hiding it. These were the first signs of hallucinations, caused by severe dehydration, starvation, and heat stroke. By the 5th and 6th weeks, Cordoba barely moved. He lay on the floor of the boat, with his head resting on a rolled-up shirt. His eyes had gone dull, his skin dry and feverish. José tried to get him to drink the rainwater they collected, but Ezekiel swallowed only tiny sips, as if his body was no longer accepting fluids. After roughly 2 months of drifting, it became clear he would not survive. One morning he opened his eyes with difficulty, stayed silent for a long moment, and then whispered a single request: not to leave his body in the ocean. It was the last thing he ever said. Within hours, he stopped breathing. José was alone on a small boat in the middle of a vast ocean, without an engine, without communication, and now without the only other human being beside him. He kept Cordoba's body next to him for several days, unsure of what the right thing to do was. Eventually, after long hesitation, he let the sea take him, saying a few words before lowering him into the water. From that moment on, the struggle was no longer shared. It was a fight of one man against the ocean. After Cordoba's death, the ocean became a completely different place. Before, José had at least someone beside him, a person who could answer, talk, or simply sit in silence. Now there was only the sound of waves and the creaking of the boat, which suddenly felt louder than ever. Loneliness didn't hit him all at once. It came gradually, like a rising tide that slowly takes away the space to breathe. For the first few days, he talked to himself, sometimes even addressing Cordoba as if he were still there. It wasn't an attempt to escape reality. It was a need to hear a voice, even if it was his own. The emptiness around him felt endless, and the silence between the waves became so deep at times that José began to fear his own thoughts. After 2 months of drifting, his life turned into a strict routine. In the morning, he checked whether any fish came near the surface. During the day, he crawled under a makeshift shelter made of plastic scraps and rope to hide from the sun. In the evening, he prepared containers to collect rainwater, if rain came at all. He learned to catch fish with his hands, to trap birds, and to store every drop of water in whatever survived the storm. But the hardest part wasn't physical. It was psychological. At night, new storms arrived, and every time he went through the same battle, holding down whatever could be thrown overboard, gripping the ropes, praying the waves would not flip the boat. After each storm, he inspected the vessel again and again, surprised that it still managed to stay afloat. By the third month of drifting, José stopped counting days. At first, he tried scratching marks on a plastic container, but it quickly became meaningless. Sun, salt, and wind erased the marks as easily as time erased weeks from his memory. He knew only one thing: time was passing, and he was still alive. And as long as he remained alive, he had no choice but to keep fighting. More than 4 months of drifting had passed when José finally saw something that looked like a miracle: a ship on the horizon. It was distant, but close enough for him to distinguish the white hull slowly moving along the waterline for a man who had seen nothing but waves and sky for months. The sight felt almost unreal. José immediately jumped to his feet, waving his arms, shouting, trying to tear off a piece of his clothing to use as an improvised signal flag. The ship kept moving steadily on its course, showing no signs of noticing him. José climbed onto one of the benches, balancing above the waves as he stretched his arms wide, desperate to be seen. He was sure that any second now someone on deck would look his way. But the ship continued on, never changing direction. It passed by, and the farther it moved away, the deeper José's despair became. Later, perhaps a few weeks after that, another ship appeared. Another hope. This time, José even threw a plastic container into the water, hoping it would reflect sunlight and catch someone's attention. But this vessel too continued its course, never noticing the tiny boat drifting alone in the vast ocean. After the second missed chance, José felt not only disappointment, but a wave of real anger. He shouted into the sky, slammed his fist against the side of the boat, and asked the ocean why it kept taking his chances away. In those moments, he felt as if the world itself was testing him to the limit. Yet at the same time, he began to notice changes in nature around him. Seaweed started appearing more frequently in the water. Birds flew lower, sometimes even landing on the edge of the boat. These were small details, but they meant something important. Land was somewhere nearby. Maybe not close, but closer than at any point during the previous months. Still, the hardest part was dealing with the thought that he might have already had a chance to survive, and lost it. José continued drifting, watching the waves and waiting for the moment when the ocean would finally allow him to reach land. More than 13 months of drifting had passed when the ocean finally began to change. At first, José didn't fully notice it, but day by day the signs became clearer. The water grew shallower, the waves softer, and small fish appeared more frequently. Birds landed on the boat more often, staying longer than before. All of this pointed to one thing: land was near. One morning, after another exhausting night, José saw something he hadn't seen in over a year: a dark line on the horizon. At first he thought it was a cloud, then he assumed it was another hallucination. But the line didn't disappear. Instead, it became sharper, more defined. It was land. His heart pounded so hard, he could barely feel his hands. The boat drifted slowly forward, and as it approached, the shapes became unmistakable. Palm trees, rocks, the outline of a shoreline. When a wave finally pushed the boat onto a shallow sandbar, José tried to stand, but his legs, weakened after months of minimal movement, wouldn't support him. He slid off the boat into the water and crawled toward the sand. 2 local residents of the Marshall Islands were the first to see him. They didn't immediately understand what they were looking at. José was so exhausted, he barely resembled a human being. Emaciated, sunburned, with hair and a beard grown beyond recognition. He tried to speak, but managed only a few broken words. He was taken to a nearby medical station, where the doctors struggled to believe what they were seeing. His body was in critical condition. Severe malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, skin damage, chronic dehydration, and yet, he was alive. The medical team said it was nothing short of a miracle. When Alvarenga's story spread around the world, many people at first refused to believe it was possible. The idea of surviving 438 days in the open ocean without navigation or communication sounded unbelievable. But further examinations, the state of his body, the known ocean currents, and the testimonies of island residents confirmed that his story was real. José later said he survived because of simple things: fishing skills, instinct, and the will to return home. For 438 days, the ocean tried to break him, and he didn't break.